for joining us today for our presentation on the TN visa. The TN is really a special option for nationals of Canada or Mexico. It really is one of the most straightforward options if you are a national of Canada or Mexico and you want to come into the US to work for an employer. So we handle these applications quite frequently and for good reason. They tend to be a great option for our clients. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga. I'm a senior associate with Scott Legal PC. And we're going to cover really a variety of aspects of the TN, starting with its basic requirements and then getting into some more complicated areas. And talking about the question that you see on your screen now, which is a common one from employers: does the TN visa require sponsorship? Our firm does focus on business immigration. However, we handle the full spectrum of immigration options, including family immigration, humanitarian immigration, and everything in between. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. This presentation is part of a series. We try to do 2 webinars a month on a variety of topics. So after this webinar, we'll send an email with a link where you can sign up for those future webinars. In that email, you'll also find our comprehensive TN visa guide, as well as a link to our YouTube channel, where we will upload a recording of this presentation, as well as shorter videos and other past webinars. So we try to put a great variety of high quality information on our YouTube channel, so do check that out. If you have a question during the presentation, you can share that with us through either the chat box or the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will be monitoring those. We'll either answer them at the moment they're asked, or we'll save them for the end. But we do plan to get through all of the questions that you ask, so please reach out with those. And we're very fortunate today to have my colleague Kelly LeGrand Weiner, who is our firm's managing attorney, with us. Kelly has processed a large number of TN visas covering the full variety of TN professions. So it's wonderful to have her sharing her expertise today. And she will handle the second half of the presentation, where we get into a little more detail on some of the uniquely challenging TN categories. So without further ado, we can go ahead and dive in and talk about what the TN visa requirements are. The first requirement, the TN visa stems from the NAFTA treaty. So it is a treaty between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So to get a TN visa, you do need to be a citizen of Mexico or Canada. You need to have an offer of employment from a US employer to work in one of a number of listed professions. Now, these professions are listed in the TN regulations, and Kelly and I will be referring to these regulations throughout the presentation. So if you'd like to have them in front of you, if you're at your computer, go ahead and Google TN NAFTA regulations. And if you click that link, you will see a list, as you scroll down, a list of professions, starting with accountant, then architect, computer systems analyst, et cetera, et cetera. You need to be coming to the US to work in one of those listed professions. Now, next to the profession, you see qualifications, either educational or experience qualifications. So if we look at the first one, accountant, we see baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA, and those are professional licenses. So those are the qualifications for an accountant. If you're coming to the US to work as an accountant, you either need to have that degree or the license. Each profession has unique qualifications. So that's what we're referring to with this third bullet on your screen. You need to satisfy those qualifications that are specific to your profession. As I mentioned, this fourth bullet, you do need a prearranged job. So you will need to show the government a letter from the employer saying that they intend to employ you in the listed profession, describing what the job duties will be and describing how you qualify for the job. And we'll talk a bit more about what that letter looks like later in the presentation. And in the job that you're coming to the US to do, you need to actually be employed to perform the job duties associated with that profession. So what does that mean? Where can you find what the US government thinks an accountant does or an architect does? Well, That's where the second key resource comes into play. And if you're at your computer, I recommend you pull this up as well. If you Google OOH, which stands for Occupational Outlook Handbook, that is the US government's publication published by the US Department of Labor, where they actually define what professions do. So if you were coming to the US to work as an accountant, you would Google OOH accountant. And then at the top of the screen, I'll go ahead and pull it up myself. You'll see a tab, and the second tab says what they do. If you click on that, you'll see a list of job duties. And those are the job duties that you need to be doing if you're coming to the US to work as an accountant on a TN visa. If you're coming to work in any of the other professions, you'd want to search OOH with that profession, look at those job duties, and make sure you're actually coming to the US to perform those job duties. The job title alone is not controlling, it's actually what you'll be doing. So a common question we get, especially from TN employers, is, as the employer, do I need to sponsor this foreign worker? And the answer in short is no. But first, it's helpful to actually define what we mean by sponsorship. Usually when an employer comes to us and is asking about sponsorship, what they have in mind is sponsorship as it relates to visas like the H-1B or the L, or even green card sponsorship. And the specific requirements to take the H-1B, for example, are that the employer needs to pay a prevailing wage, which is almost always higher than the minimum wage. The employer needs to make sure that the visa holder is actually employed. They're prohibited from doing something called benching, which is when they bring someone into the US and don't actually employ them. If the worker's terminated, the employer may need to pay for them to return home. These are all requirements that apply to the H-1B. They do not apply to the TN. So for the TN, the employer's obligations are really minimal. Really, all that the TN employer needs to do is to sign a letter that honestly represents their intention to employ the worker and sets out what the intended pay is, what the intended hours are. This is not a contract. The government is not going to sue the employer to enforce the contract. It really is the employer representing to the government that their intention is to employ this worker for a specific wage. But the worker is at will, meaning that the employee can be terminated and the employee can quit. So there is no required wage. There's, of course, you should pay above minimum wage. You can't violate federal or local law and pay under minimum wage, but there's no prevailing wage. There's no set wage for a specific profession. There's also no requirement that the employer test the labor market and find if there's a US citizen who's willing to work. None of those are requirements for the TN. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the option of filing for a TN from within the United States, which you see is the last bullet on your screen. A small distinction: if an employee is applying for TN status from within the US, they would apply through USCIS through a change of status. And if that happens, then the employer would need to sign the forms that are submitted to USCIS. But that still does not create any additional obligations that would otherwise be present. So what I said before about sponsorship and how it really doesn't apply to a TN would still apply, even though the employer would be the one signing and submitting an application through USCIS. If the applicant, if the employee is applying at a port of entry, so that would mean at a border, a land border, or at an airport, and for nationals of Mexico, we'll talk a bit more about this. If they're applying at a consulate, then it's the employee who's applying. And so if it would be the employee actually representing themselves as the applicant, really just presenting the employer's letter, and that would be the only place where the employer is signing any part of the application. But again, that's at a consulate or at a port of entry. And if the application is denied through a port of entry or at the consulate, that would be a denial on the employee. It would not be a denial on the employer. as it would be if they were applying through USCIS, because the employer is submitting the application there. I've hinted at some of these distinctions. There is a difference for nationals of Canada and Mexico who are applying for a TN visa. The reason for that is that the US government agency that has authority to allow people to enter the United States, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, they actually have the power to adjudicate TN applications for nationals of Canada. So that means that nationals of Canada can actually apply for TN status at an airport or at a land crossing, and that is extremely convenient. That means that someone who's in Canada or in the US, if they want an essentially immediate decision on a TN visa, all they have to do is leave the US and come back in through an airport or a land crossing and present their TN application, and they would immediately know if they're granted TN status. Nationals of Mexico, in contrast, do actually need to have a TN visa in their passport. So what that means is they would need to apply at a US consulate, and they'd need to do everything that's required as part of that. That means file a DS-160 form with the consulate, come in for an interview if they're not given an interview waiver, and actually provide their passport, get the visa actually put in their passport, and then they would need to enter the US. For Canadians, visas, meaning when they come into the US, they can be granted status for up to 3 years. That is also true of nationals of Mexico. When they come into the US, they can be granted status for up to 3 years. Mexican nationals, when they apply at a consulate in the past, they were limited to a much shorter visa validity period. Now, fortunately, they can pay an additional fee and actually get a TN visa for up to 4 years. So that's a wonderful change for nationals of Mexico. And as I mentioned before, when they enter the US on that visa, regardless of the length of the visa, they would typically be given 3 years of status unless their job is for a shorter period. Let's see, was there anything? An important distinction: if a national of Canada is married to someone who is not a national of Canada, their spouse or their children, if they have dependents who are not nationals of Canada, would need to apply for TD status, dependent status, at a consulate. So again, you must be a national of Canada for CBP to grant you TN status or TD status at the border. And while I'm talking about spouses, you do, as a spouse, you are eligible for what's called TD dependent status. You're not allowed to work. However, you are allowed to study in the US in TD status. We'll talk about a few more details about the differences between Canadians and Mexican nationals later in the presentation. But for now, I will pass it off to Kelly to talk about one of the most challenging categories, which is the management consultant category.
Thank you, Dustin. Yes, so the management consultant category is an interesting one. So this is one that gets used a lot because it does not require a degree. So this is one of the rare TN categories where you can qualify with just experience. And that would be either 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to a consulting agreement. So because this category is often used as a catch-all, it is kind of heavily scrutinized. So it's one where you can expect an officer to, look in more detail to see, does this really qualify as a management consultant position? So there's like certain things you need to consider. A management consultant position, unless you're working for a management consulting company, then if you're just coming into another regular company, this really should be a supernumerary role. So it's not a permanent role. They're not hiring you, to do a permanent job. Generally, a management consultant is the type of job where you're going to come in for a specified period of time, and achieve certain goals, look at the operations and then make recommendations to management. So there is kind of a very specific, set of things you would be doing as a management consultant. And you want to make sure that the job actually does align with that, and just know that, much more likely to receive, questions than, for example, let's say that you have an accounting degree and you're coming in as an accountant for the job title of accountant. That's a very straightforward type of case. With a management consultant, much more likely that you're going to get questions. Similarly, with the economist category, this is another one where we also see, kind of more pushback, more questions. So one reason for this is that previously this category was really widely used not only for economists, but also to encompass kind of roles that were financial analysis roles and market research analyst roles. And there was a policy memo, from Customs and Border Patrol, where they basically said, we do not view the economist category as being expansive enough to include financial analysts and market research analysts. So these, categories were specifically excluded from, use under the economist category, and that really had a big impact, particularly for market research analysts. I think for people doing financial analysis, it's really quite a difficult line to draw as to whether you will qualify as an economist or not. However, it is something where you do need to be very careful about how you're describing the job. As Dustin mentioned, you would need to look at the OOH, to determine what qualifies as an economist. It's also a good idea to look at the policy memo, as the policy memo lays out some considerations, to think about in terms of what is the line between financial analyst and economist, because it can, be a bit blurry to figure out. So these are both categories where it's going to be, a bit more, kind of risky to get this type of TN. Certainly there's, some people that are going to fall very squarely within the requirements where it's very, clear cut and straightforward. But oftentimes if you're using these categories because you don't have a degree, or maybe you were a financial analyst and you're seeing if it can fit as an economist still, you can expect a bit more risk. All right, so let's talk a bit about the TN application process, and it's different for Canadians and Mexicans. So if you are a Canadian national, then you can apply for the TN at a port of entry. So you can provide your job offer letter, your supporting documentation. So you need, your passport proving you're a Canadian citizen, as well as your proof of your educational and professional qualifications. And then that job offer letter that outlines all the necessary details. So the wages, should have the company letterhead, should have an original signature, explain, what the timing is, when the job will start. Something to consider for Canadians, you get that benefit of being able to go right to the border, so you can apply very quickly. Some ports of entry are considered optimized ports. So this means that, these are ports that have kind of put resources, into place to create a faster, more streamlined application experience. So especially if you're applying for the first time, Customs and Border Patrol does, recommend that you, try to go to an optimized port. It's not required, but it certainly will, create a process that's a bit faster and smoother than, perhaps another port where they're not as familiar, with the process. If you are a Mexican national, then the way that you get a TN visa is you actually apply for a visa stamp at a consulate. So for this, it's going to take a little bit longer, in the sense that you can't just go to any port of entry. You would file a DS-160, you will pay your visa application fee. There's also a biometrics appointment, and then you would actually attend an appointment at the consulate where they will review all of your documents and determine if you qualify for the visa. If you do, then they'll collect your passport, put the stamp in your passport, and then you can enter the United States to begin work. Then kind of a third option that's available to both, Mexican and Canadian nationals is if you're already in the United States in a valid status, you can apply with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So in this case, the employer is going to have to file what's called Form I-129 with USCIS, and they will file all those supporting documents we've been talking about, to the job offer letter, the proof of the, proof of the education, Um, I'd say that generally, generally it's preferable to either go to the port of entry, or go to the consulate. However, the option with USCIS is there, and especially during the pandemic when it was harder for people to travel or harder to get, an appointment at a consulate, that USCIS option, I think was quite helpful. All right, so let's just talk about some, tips and visa pitfalls. So, one tip I think always call ahead to the port of entry. If you're unfamiliar with it or you're unfamiliar with the procedures, especially during COVID, some ports of entry maybe had, specific times when they wanted people to show up. That's really not the case as much anymore, but it can be very helpful just because each port is different. Each port does have kind of their own procedures. And it can be helpful just to call ahead and see what they recommend. How early do they recommend getting there before your flight? Do they have any specific times when it will be easier or faster for you to come in? So they will have a publicly available line, and calling can kind of answer some of those concerns. So another, thing to consider is make sure that the employer contact you signed the letter is available in case the border officer calls to verify any details of the job. So I think this is generally quite rare unless they have concerns about, fraud, but any kind of, if you're putting an email address on there, if you're putting a phone number on there, you don't want to just alert the person who signed the letter that, you're crossing the border and when you're crossing the border, so that if they do get some type of contact from Customs and Border Protection, that they're aware, that they're ready for it, and that they're prepared to explain what's in the letter. So the officer feels comfortable that the information that you're presenting is accurate information. So always want to bring your diploma, the original, your official transcript, and the original signed version of the employer letter. So some ports are very picky and they want that wet ink original signature. So just to avoid having to, withdraw the application and go back, we always recommend kind of, just making sure you have that original signature, just because some ports are still, quite picky about it. So a final thing to consider is that the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa, and it does require that you have non-immigrant intent, meaning you don't intend to live in the United States permanently. So the TN can be renewed indefinitely. And so what this means is that at a certain point, if you've been in the United States, you've renewed, 3, 4 times, and maybe you're with the same company, they could start to ask questions, what are your plans? What is your intent? How long do you plan to stay in the United States? And so you should be prepared, to show ties to your home country. Especially if you've been in the US for a long time with the same employer. I think if you're kind of switching employers, you're not going through the full 3 years. Sometimes there's a bit more of an argument, you're building your career. But definitely a good thing to consider is just that the longer you're on the TN, the longer that you're coming to the United States, the more you want to make sure that you do have that proof of ties, to your home country as they start to inquire more about it, on your second or third or fourth, TN renewal.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. And we have received some great questions. So why don't we go ahead and dive into those. The first question we received actually gives us a good opportunity to walk through kind of how we would look at an application when someone comes to us and we're figuring out if they meet the qualifications. So this question says, I'm a pharmacist from my home country, but the requirement to get a license says I need a 5-year degree course, but in my home country, it's only 5 years. So is there any other qualification, any other way that I would be able to qualify as a pharmacist? Now, to walk through this question, as I mentioned before, the first step would be to look at the regulations. So unfortunately for a TN, there's not a substitute. If you don't meet either the educational or the experience requirement, you cannot substitute those for, say, experience, unless the regulation says that you can. So if we look at pharmacists, we see you either need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a state or provincial license. So the other thing that I think is important to note here is that when it's referring to a degree or a license, it's talking about those within either Canada or Mexico. So You can have, I know there's another question here. I have a degree from a country outside the US, Canada, and Mexico. You can use those, but you're going to need to get an equivalency exam where essentially you get a third party to say that your degree from France is equivalent to what the TN regulations require, within the US, or equivalent to a US degree, for example. So to go back to the pharmacist degree, if you have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree from Canada or Mexico that's in pharmacy, you meet the requirement. Or if you have a state or provincial license that was issued in Canada or Mexico for a pharmacist, you meet the qualification. Now, that is kind of regardless of what your background was. As long as, say, for the license you have from Canada, you had, extensive education in India, say. You don't have to get into that necessarily in the TN application, as long as you can show that you meet the requirement on its face. Kelly, I don't know if you had more to add there. I want to make sure that I'm not missing a part of the question.
No, I think.
Okay, perfect. So I see a couple quick questions we can get through. The I-94 form is the form that someone is given when they come into the US. Sometimes nationals of Canada are not given that form, but that's an exception rather than the rule. But if you want to find your I-94, you can Google CBP I-94 and you can actually look at your form online. They are typically digital these days. And they're important because they tell you how long you can stay in the US and what your status is, which defines what you can do in the US. Kelly, were there any questions you saw that you wanted to? A couple came
So
in
I
along
think
those
there's
lines.
a few have come in. Someone's talking about, like manufacturing professional, manager in a food manufacturing plant. So, I think this is the type of question that's good for, a consult. None of the very obvious ones come to mind, but definitely something that we could discuss in a consult. And as a Canadian national, an E2, or a Mexican national, an E2 could also potentially, be available. Someone's asking about the engineering category. If you have a mechanical engineering degree, is it an issue to apply using for a software engineering position? I think, again, this is the type of thing where, nuanced kind of analysis would need to be done to kind of look at your transcript and see, is there an alignment? If you have, for an engineer position, if you have an engineering degree and there's enough alignment with the software engineering role, potentially, could be a fit, but, maybe getting a few questions depending on kind of what's in the transcripts. Someone's asking about graphic design, marketing university degree with a few graphic design. So this is, I think, a similar answer, right? Like you have to look to the transcript, see, how many courses are really relevant and kind of what kind of argument can you make that there's, that this type of degree would really count as, relevant for the particular position. So someone's asking, I have a pharmacist license in Canada, but don't qualify for a US license due to the 5-year requirement. So, if I get a job offer, I won't be able to work. So I think that, that's really specific to the state that you're going to work in and what the licensing requirements are, so, I mean, yes, it's possible, right, that you could get the TN, you could qualify for the TN, but then not be able to work in the state because you don't meet those licensing requirements. So yes, those are both concerns that would need to be addressed. So there's not just an immigration piece to that. There's also a, regulatory piece for the state. Do you have the proper licenses to do the job? So that's something that you would have to consider. So I think those are all the questions that we have. So I think we can close there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kelly. Great questions from our audience. Do keep an eye out for our follow-up email, and we hope to see you on future webinars.
Thank you.